TNCRadio.LIVE, your commercial driver navigation station.
Good afternoon. This is TNCRadio.LIVE, and this is the Truckers Network Radio Show with your host, Shelley Johnson.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. Yes, this is the Truckers Network Radio Show on TNCRadio.LIVE, where we offer the entertainment, sports, weather, traffic, and news that commercial drivers want to hear. Health topics are definitely of an interest to our drivers, and many drivers can suffer from neurological diseases later in life, unfortunately. Many have family members who suffer from conditions like Alzheimer's. Did you know that Robin Williams was misdiagnosed with Parkinson's before he died? We have an expert on this subject, Dr. Russell Lebovitz, to talk about what happened to Robin, as well as educate us on all the different neurological conditions. Dr. Russell Lebovitz is the co-founder and CEO of biotech diagnostics company Amprion. Prior to his management career, he served as a senior scientist and research physician for over 15 years. He served on the faculty of Baylor College of Medicine in Houston and the Fox Chase Cancer Center in Philadelphia. Welcome, Dr. Lebovitz. I appreciate you being on the show with us today. And wow, I'm really surprised that Robin was misdiagnosed. How does this all happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. And first of all, I want to thank you for having me today on the show. And neurodegenerative diseases, the ones that we know the most about are Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and they cover a lot of brain functions that tend to degenerate as we get older. And they can be cognitive, so you lose your memory, you lose your ability to do executive function. They can be primarily motor, and we lose the ability to move freely. And in Robin Williams' case, like many other people, you get a series of symptoms that evolve over time, and even the best clinicians, in their hands, it's challenging to know which of these diseases the person is likely to have, and therefore it's difficult to predict where it's heading. So Robin Williams had the best care possible, but we will misdiagnose from clinical symptoms alone probably 25% of the time with something like Parkinson's, and with other diseases and types of dementia, it can be 40 to 50% of the time. So we are still learning, and we're trying to improve our ability to diagnose based on what we'll call molecular diagnosis, actually looking at what is causing the disease. And if we can measure that independently of symptoms, we believe that we can do a lot better and help people more moving forward.
Now, what did Robin have?
Robin Williams ended up with something called Lewy Body Dementia, which is not so uncommon. It's the second most common neurodegenerative disease related to dementia and memory loss. But Lewy Body Dementia it's very confusing because it can have symptoms that look just like Parkinson's, symptoms that look just like Alzheimer's, and even symptoms that make us some set of these, some subset or combination. It can be really difficult. And Lewy Body Dementia is really a very, very difficult one to diagnose right now, or has been. And we're working at Amprion, my company, on tools that really help identify, in particular, Lewy Body Dementia and Parkinson's, since they have a lot more overlaps than the other diseases.
Now, I know that Robin had a cocaine problem many decades before. Would that have created some of the possibility that he would have developed this? Or what causes these neurological conditions? I mean, you have to wonder.
Yeah, it's interesting. As we look, these diseases we'll call sporadic because we can't identify major causes. But there are certain links. I don't know, to be honest. I don't have any data to suggest that cocaine use is a major factor, but there are genetic factors, things that families tend to cluster. We know that for Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and even Lewy Body Dementia, repeated head injuries at different stages of life. So boxers, athletes who bang their heads a lot, people in the military who have traumatic head injuries on multiple occasions. Those are the things we understand well. On the other hand, there are things that people believe that virus infections in certain cases at various stages of life may trigger this. But the point is, in all these diseases, there are probably many different initial triggers, but there are only a few pathways that are able to make the disease progress and end up destroying very significant parts of our brain by the time we're in our 60s, 70s, 80s, or beyond.
So would Robin have been suffering from this for quite a while before it ever really started to manifest, where people could see what was going on and he would notice it?
Yeah, another great question. One of the things we've learned as we develop molecular markers to actually track the disease before there are symptoms is that the diseases, probably these neurodegenerative diseases in general, take 20 or 30 years, as you say, to manifest in terms of clear clinical symptoms where you might show up at a neurologist's office. But they probably are diseases of relatively young or middle-aged people if we think in terms of what causes them. So we have to remember that we think of these as diseases of aging, and they are, but only because it takes so long for these diseases to develop within the brain and then manifest with symptoms.
Now, I had read that, like with Alzheimer's, it's a buildup of amyloid proteins in the brain. Is that true with all of these conditions, or?
Yes, you're spot on here. So one of the things we're learning, and neurodegenerative diseases now are getting a lot more attention because over time, people used to die of infectious diseases, and then they would die of heart disease, and then they would die of cancers. So as we make progress with each of these, we find that now the more prevalent causes of problems as we get older and death turn out to be neurodegenerative diseases. And so the answer is that all of the neurodegenerative diseases we're learning involve something very unusual that we never recognized with other diseases. And we'll call them, these are misfolded protein, or what we call prion diseases. And what it really is, these are diseases of proteins gone rogue in our brain. So in the case of Alzheimer's, the protein that goes rogue first is called a beta amyloid. But what happens is, for all of the proteins in neurodegenerative diseases that have gone rogue or taken on a prion-like form, it's very much, these proteins are like transformers in the movie or the television show, that literally they have a certain structure, but that structure can flip into different shapes. Like as a transformer could be a truck or a robot. In this case, a protein can be something that helps or something that actually damages a cell and learns how to replicate and make other copies of itself. So for Alzheimer's, the two main prion-like proteins are A beta amyloid and another called tau. For Lewy Body Dementia and for Parkinson's, the protein that is this transformer, this protein gone rogue, this prion protein, is called alpha-synuclein. So one of the things that is really important is to understand which protein has gone rogue, and it helps us understand which disease, ultimately which treatment, and it helps us predict the symptoms in each person in advance.
So would you say that it is not that these diseases are more prevalent, we're just more aware of them today? Because you really didn't, I don't think people heard about Alzheimer's and various other things decades and decades ago. Are we just more mindful and we've learned a lot more?
Well, that's partly it, but I think the most important factor is that people are living longer. So if we go back to what we talked about a few minutes ago, and let's just say on average, these are diseases that begin in our 20s or 30s or 40s, and they take 25 to 40 years to develop. When people were dying on average at age 70 or 72, then they just didn't have time to develop these symptoms. Now that we're living longer, again, we don't die as often of infectious disease. Heart disease is much more under control. We're making great progress in extending lifespan with cancer. So more of us are ending up in our late 70s to late 80s and even 90s. So we're seeing a lot more because that's what's left to hit us next.
And it's so devastating because it comes out of nowhere. And it totally robs a person of themselves, and they become trapped. And it's just so very sad. And I think that years and years ago, like with what may have been Alzheimer's, they called it senility. I think that things were just kind of talked about differently. But we are so grateful to have you on the show, Dr. Lebovitz. We definitely want to learn more about all of these conditions because there's so much to learn. We're talking with Dr. Russell Lebovitz, co-founder and CEO of biotech diagnostics company Amprion. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show here on TNCRadio.LIVE. Stay tuned for more coming up.
This blog is brought to you by the Truckers Network at app.thetruckersnetwork.net. 5 awesome tips for finding safe overnight truck parking. Truck drivers face many challenges in their career, and finding safe overnight truck parking is one of those challenges. After the tragic murder of truck driver Jason Rivenberg, Jason's Law went into effect to help protect the thousands of truck drivers who need to find safe overnight parking. Although Jason's Law was put into place to help drivers, safe truck parking continues to be an issue for truck drivers across America. We've put together a list of tips that'll help you make the process of finding safe overnight parking easier for you. Plan your trip. Pre-planning your trip is something every truck driver should consider doing. Not only does it allow you to map out your overnight parking, but it allows you to map out where you can get fuel and food. Before you hit the road, take a look at your route. Avoid scheduling truck parking in high-crime cities or congested areas. Pro tip, download the app Truck Park. With over 200 secure locations, the Truck Park app allows drivers to schedule their overnight parking in advance, so drivers don't have to worry about driving around to find a parking spot. Not only is it a relief to have your parking spot booked, but it's also more productive with HOS. Also, if you're a member of the Truckers Network, drivers get instant access to a 15% off promo code to use when booking a parking spot with TruckSpot. You can sign up for just $5 a month. Park early. If you don't choose to reserve your parking spot through Truck Park, we suggest parking early. The majority of safe parking spots will fill up quickly before it gets dark. If you can, start driving early in the morning so that when it's time to quit driving for the day, you won't find yourself fighting for a parking space. Park in a well-lit area. Walmart parking lots are an extremely popular location for overnight parking. Why? Because they're well-lit areas. When planning your trip, it may be difficult to know whether they have well-lit parking available. If you find yourself in a situation where you don't feel safe, talk to your dispatcher. They might be able to help you find secure truck parking. Lock it up. It may seem like a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised as to how many truck drivers forget to lock up their truck and trailer for the night. So before you go to sleep for the night, make sure to lock everything. Insert a dash cam. Dash cams are a great way to provide evidence if your truck was in an accident or vandalized. It's always refreshing to know that you have an extra set of eyes on your truck. This blog was brought to you by the Truckers Network at app.thetruckersnetwork.net. You're listening to TNCRadio.LIVE. Remember to tune in to the Truckers Network radio show with Shelley Johnson weekdays at 3 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Eastern.
This is the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.LIVE. I'm Shelley Johnson with Tom Kelly. We're speaking with Dr. Russell Lebovitz, an expert on neurological conditions such as Alzheimer's. Tom, you said you had some questions for Dr. Lebovitz.
Yeah, we have our first caller. Oh, wait a minute. It's just me. I'm the first caller. Doctor, we were talking off air, and I told you that I was diagnosed with Parkinson's nearly 10 years ago, symptomatic for 2 to 3 years ahead of time, which began as a little shaking in my right hand and finally became pronounced enough that my wife one day said, "So when are we going to talk about your shaking hand?" And I was like, "Why'd you bring this up? We've had 2 years where it's been doing that. You didn't mention it." I think a lot of guys, with the onset of some of these symptoms, tend to write it off to something else. I don't know what I thought it was. I didn't think much of it. It was just annoying. would do things like click on the mouse when I didn't mean to, and that kind of stuff. And it just got worse and worse until I finally went and saw a doctor, and now I have medicine that helps me a lot. But the same medicine for me doesn't seem to help other people who also have been diagnosed with Parkinson's. So two-part question in there. One is, do you think that the male species of the population here sometimes ignores these symptoms longer than we should? And the second part of the question is, and I lost it. So go with the first one first.
Okay. So the answer to that, I think, just knowing how we operate is absolutely yes, things go wrong. And until the evidence piles up to a point where either we come to the conclusion, or much more frequently our partner comes to the conclusion that we need to see a doctor, I think that's part of it. And just as an aside, Parkinson's has a preference for men about 1.5 times, while Alzheimer's has a preference for women about 1.5 times. And, as you talk about symptoms and how people figure it out, obviously things progress to the point where if you can't do your normal function, then you often will see a doctor. But in the case of Parkinson's, and in Lewy Body Dementia, which we've talked about a little bit, one of the things they share is a very early symptom is a sleep disturbance where you start thrashing around in your sleep and actually acting out your dreams. And the reason this one's important is because the thrashing and the acting out often suddenly just hits your partner in the face, or they get kicked. And when that happens on multiple nights and on a regular basis, very often the partner will say, hey, we got to go see a doctor. There's something here that isn't working. So, partners and caregivers, neurodegenerative diseases, as much as any other disease, are really a disease of a community, a family, a partnership.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing. And so I would say, don't follow my example. That and a lot of times our drivers, they're by themselves for a long period of time, and it's and the life as a truck driver especially is tiring, and it's easy, I think, to write things off to, well, I'm just tired, and I've been working hard the last 3 weeks, and after I get home and, relax some, this is just tension and all of that kind of stuff. But, if your wife starts saying, your partner starts saying, hey, something's not right here, you should heed that advice.
Yes, sir. And so you've mentioned, so just to build upon that if one is a driver and sitting still for a long period of time, your muscles become stiff. But one of the early signs of Parkinson's, for example, is muscles becoming rigid and sore. But it turns out to be in a different way. It's not the same reason that it is for someone who's sitting still all the time or sitting in one or two positions. So these are not easy. At the early stages, one of the things I'm here to talk about today is how we understand these diseases as diseases of specific molecules and markers, where long before we have symptoms that our partner notices, we might be able to make a diagnosis and help people at the earliest possible stages by actually having a test that's definitive and accurate.
That would be wonderful. Yeah.
What kind of test would that be? Because you can't really see the brain.
Well, you're absolutely right. There are some tests where you can do very advanced radioactive imaging of the brain, and so you can see plaque or tangles associated with Alzheimer's, but those are very involved and very expensive tests. And what we're moving towards are tests that look at molecules that are either in the blood or the spinal fluid that are unique, meaning if you have something that we detect in your blood or spinal fluid, then the probability that you have that disease is approaching 100%. And we're moving towards that. We're understanding not so much what causes the disease, because as we've talked about in the last segment, the disease might ultimately be caused by banging your head a bunch of times. But
Right.
What really happens is that we talked about this. You get a protein, and the protein goes rogue, and it's a protein misfolding disease that looks like a transformer, and that's what spreads the disease. It might just start in one cell, but over time, that goes from one transformer-like protein to thousands. That spreads to the next cell where you make thousands. And so by detecting these proteins, we understand that this is what having full-blown disease is. And this is why, one banging of the head suddenly leads to damage throughout the brain. It takes 30 years to get from one transformer-like protein to billions, and to get from, one injured cells to millions.
But quite often, people can suffer a concussion in their lifetime, but that doesn't always mean that they're going to develop a degenerative condition. Am I correct?
Absolutely. What we're doing here in talking about head injuries is looking backwards. Mm-hmm. So what happens more frequently to people who have these diseases compared to people who don't? So one of the first ways we started noticing this is that boxers, some, who very famous, at a fairly early age, in their late 40s, 50s, early 60s, suddenly develop Parkinson's or related neurodegenerative diseases. So one can go back and look that way. But that is absolutely, if you fall and hit your head and you have a concussion, what you do is you increase the probability of initiating one of these diseases. And that's why we know if you're doing it every day and being hit in the head, or you have multiple concussions, it can happen with athletes. There's certain work-related situations where people get hit in the head, that we know that certain people in the military who are on the front lines and have traumatic head injuries on multiple occasions have a higher frequency. So you're absolutely right. One instance isn't enough, but we do know that the more it happens, the more likely you are to fall in that group.
Sorry, Sean.
Go ahead, Tom.
I was going to say, okay, so let's talk about our drivers a little bit. So that they're out there, some of them 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, a couple, 4 million mile drivers, and they're not necessarily banging their heads, but they're in this truck where their head is shaking, because you can't hold your head perfectly still when you're driving a truck. So their head is shaking and bobbing up and down and back and forth and sideways and so forth for hours, 11 hours at a time. And, it's maybe not that much in a row, but you get my idea, for, thousands, tens of thousands of hours. You have to wonder, what is that doing to the brain?
I think it's a great question, and I hope it's something that someone will look at. So as we say that a handful of times being knocked out, that might be equivalent to, as you say, hundreds or thousands of hours of just a shaking back and forth or a vibration. But I don't have the data to say that for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me. And if someone wanted to look into it, I'd be really interested in knowing the answer or working with them.
Yeah, that's good. So how close do you think we are to having these molecular tests that you mentioned?
Yeah, well, I think we're at the stage now where we actually have the first generation. So I'll talk about Parkinson's and Lewy Body Dementia, which are caused by a rogue protein called alpha-synuclein. And at our company, Amprion, we've pioneered a test that looks at these transformed prion-like forms of synuclein, and we can detect them at very, very high sensitivity and accuracy. And what we're finding is that people who don't have the disease and don't go on to a progressive disease like Parkinson's or Lewy Body Dementia don't have these proteins. And those that have symptoms and go on to have all of the clear signs of Parkinson's or Lewy Body Dementia do have it. It is almost diagnostic. It really is. If you have this and you have any other symptoms, the answer is likely to be that you have this disease. We can even look up to 20 years so far earlier and predict who's going to get the disease with great accuracy. So I think we're on the threshold, and I'd say in the next year, the test, Amprion's test, we're releasing this month for the first time. There are tests for A-beta amyloid, and there are tests being developed for tau, another protein associated that transforms into a prion-like form in Alzheimer's. So of the three major proteins that appear to cause Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Lewy body dementia, all of those, we are literally in 2021 likely to be able to have a test done if we suspect these diseases.
Which would really help in terms of early treatment. Certainly people probably don't want to know. I'm sure that would be some of the hesitation. But if you know enough in advance, then you can seek the proper medical care. It would make sense, and that would be a godsend to patients as well as their families. We're talking with Dr. Russell Lebovitz. He's an expert on neurological conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. This is the Truckers Network radio show here on TNCRadio.LIVE. Stay tuned for more information coming up.
This blog on TNCRadio.LIVE is brought to you by the Truckers Network at app.thetruckersnetwork.net. 5 easy steps to help truckers stay awake while driving. Driving 11 hours a day, 7 days a week can be emotionally and physically exhausting. Sleep's a very important part of a long-haul truck driver's life. Being well rested and alert makes driving a lot more safe for both the trucker and other drivers on the road. Getting enough sleep may sound easier than it seems. Living on the road makes it difficult to get the recommended 8 hours of sleep. In fact, it's common for truckers to not get 8 hours of sleep due to the 11-hour work shift. To help, we've put together 5 tips to help truckers stay awake while driving. Take vitamins. One way truckers can stay awake while driving is by taking vitamins. Not only are vitamins good energy boosters, they have tons of other health benefits too. Vitamin B helps with fatigue, depression, mood boosting, and muscle weakness. Consider adding vitamins to your morning routine.
This is the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.LIVE. I'm Shelley Johnson with Tom Kelly. We're speaking with Dr. Russell Lebovitz, the co-founder and CEO of biotech diagnostics company Amprion. He's an expert on neurological conditions like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. We were talking about the early detection that you're doing with your company, Dr. Lebovitz. That, what I would think, would seriously help give patients hope in terms of being able to treat something in an early stage, would it not?
Oh, absolutely. What we like to say is that early detection enables early prevention. And what we mean by that is there are a number of things that if you know that you are on this path and you have Parkinson's or you have Lewy body dementia, or if you're on the path to Alzheimer's, but you find out when everything is still mostly intact and you can function, then you can take control. And the ways one can take control are numerous. So to start with, there's evidence for both dementia, Alzheimer's, motor diseases, Parkinson's, that changing lifestyle, diet, exercise really can make a difference in slowing down the disease. No one's arguing at this point that once you have full-blown disease, that if you start exercising, it's going to go away. But if you know that you're at a very early stage, at least as far as the data holds out, that changing your lifestyle can slow it down. And if it means that you might be able to work and spend time and be fully functional for 10 extra years, that's a gift. The other things that people can do is, as you've said, Shelley, you can enroll yourself in a clinical trial. You can say, look, I've got a molecular signature for Parkinson's or for Lewy body dementia or for Alzheimer's, and yet mostly it's still early. I'm okay. I have the wherewithal. I would like to enter into a clinical trial. And I believe there are hundreds, if not 1,000, clinical trials ongoing in the United States right now for medical devices or drugs that are aiming to stop or slow down Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other diseases. So you're absolutely right. It is a godsend, and I feel so fortunate to be able to be working on one of these and to be able to see that it really works. And the last thing I want to say on this question is that actually today, the first new drug for Alzheimer's has been approved really almost in the last 20 years. And while it's somewhat controversial because at late stage, it slows down the disease, but it doesn't stop it. It's the beginning of a new wave. If neurodegenerative diseases turn out to be like cancer, almost all cancers that are treated successfully use multiple drugs. Before you can have multiple drugs, you have to have one approved. So we now have one that looks at misfolded proteins, in this case, A-beta amyloid, and slows down the growth or gets rid of or reduces the amount of A-beta amyloid. So this is a big deal because it gives us one drug. It makes it easier to get combinations because we have one that works. Now, who is most suitable for these drugs? That's going to be determined by the types of tests that Amprion and other companies are developing. But we now have, it's not hope in 10 years. We have something today, our first. It certainly will not be our best, but one is infinitely better than zero.
Absolutely.
Doc, I was going to ask you too, it seems like we know as humans, pretty much everything there is to know about, say, a kidney or a liver or whatever. But it seems like we know so little about the brain, which of course is, us using our brains to study a brain. Am I way off there, or is there still just like so much we don't even know what we don't know at this point?
Well, you're so spot on with that question. And the reason for that is, there are things about all of us that are almost identical, and that would be our kidneys. Our kidneys are built to do a few things. They do them well, and they do the same for every single person. So that's something easier to understand. The brain is really largely who we are. There are parts of the brain that do things the same. We all breathe. We all maintain our blood pressure under normal circumstances. But what makes us who we are is the way that after we're born and as we learn, we make connections in the brain between cells. And it's those very complicated patterns that determine who we are. But because it's different for every single person, it's so hard then to figure out what disrupts it, what diseases. So we end up with diseases like Alzheimer's, where we say, all right, your memory goes. We can't say what memory goes, but we understand from that where memory is laid down, where learning happens. But it's so complicated, and there are so many different connections, and they're different in every single person, that we have to develop newer and better tools, and we are. But it makes sense that the brain is the final frontier in medicine and biology, because every one of our brains is different, and the way it becomes different is our life experiences. So, your question is spot on, and I'm happy to delve into other aspects if you would like.
Dr. Lebovitz, my own personal experience, my mother over 20 years ago came down with herpes encephalitis. I had never heard of this sort of thing happening. It was a cold sore that went to her brain. She was actually hospitalized in a coma for a month. She survived, which everyone was just shocked that she could survive. She had damage to her left temporal lobe. I had a heck of a time getting answers, what to expect. What's happening. And what we did see over a period of years, of about 12 years, we were able to keep her home. She would have intermittent TIAs, or trans-ischemic attacks, kind of like mini strokes, and she would have some epileptic issues, very, very minor. And I am of the opinion that continued to maybe create some more damage, because she started to develop dementia. And it was, wow. It was a learning experience for me, and certainly very emotional. I mean, you're literally watching your loved one wasting away, and that she was just an amazing person before all of this happened. I mean, she did everything. Everybody thought she was, immortal. I just, I think that's what a lot of families are dealing with. Where do they find the answers?
Yeah, I think you bring up a great example, and specifically, and then we can talk about the bigger question. Turns out that herpes encephalitis is rare, but it's not unheard of. And there's some evidence that people have looked in the brains of people sort of after the fact with Alzheimer's and other types of dementia, and found tracers that would suggest that they had a herpes virus infection earlier in life. So herpes and other virus infections are one of the things that 30 or 40 years later can lead to dementia, just as you've described here. One of the major issues that we should probably spend a minute or two on, relevant to your questions, why the brain is different. One way that the brain is so different than almost every other tissue, almost every organ, if you damage it, even if you damage it extensively, it regenerates. So your liver, you can remove 7/8 of it, and the 1/8 that remains will grow back to be fully functional. Yep. Even things like kidneys, we know we can live without one kidney. We have another, and it's capable of compensating. So we can regenerate so many of our organs. The one organ mainly that doesn't regenerate, the cells can't regrow if they're killed, is the brain. So we don't have the same margin for error in the brain that we have anywhere else. And one of the reasons for that, as we said earlier, who you are is the connections you make in the brain between various cells. If those cells suddenly try to protect them, but if they're regenerating all over the place and changing, then who you are would change dramatically. So we try to build a brain, we protect it with something called the blood-brain barrier. Right. And so we over time to work, it doesn't regenerate, it doesn't regrow, and there are advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage is in something like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, where we're killing nerve cells. If it was in our kidney, those cells would grow back. In the brain, they can't, and so those memories are gone. Those motor functions are gone, and that's the reason we absolutely need early detection before the cells actually die and drop out.
You have to wonder, and this is where you said that research is continuing as to determine who is more likely to get this sort of a condition. Obviously, in my mother's case, it was a total shock. It's like, what the heck? But obviously, she'd had, as the epidemiologist told me, cold sore. And it stores in the dorsal ganglia. And it can, if your immune system's compromised in any way, it can come back out. Which is very scary. And of course, that's where I wanted to kind of address when we come back, if you wouldn't mind, some of the effects of COVID and some of the neurological complaints some of the patients are having, what they call the long haul symptomology of COVID. We're talking to Dr. Russell Lebovitz, the co-founder and CEO of biotech diagnostics company Amprion. Please stay tuned here on TNCRadio.LIVE. We've got more great information coming up. Finding the right healthcare plan and insurance agent can be a challenge. Truck driving can be a dangerous job, and drivers expose themselves to unique health risks. Health insurance is an expensive but necessary expense for truck drivers. It helps protect them from unexpected high medical costs. Although truck drivers should have a health plan, many don't. Some trucking companies offer health plans for truck drivers, but if you're an owner-operator or an independent contractor, you might have to find your own health insurance policy. The Truckers Network proudly partners with the Health Plan Partner to help our members learn about the options they have for health insurance. The Health Plan Partner is dedicated to helping members of the Truckers Network find and learn about what's available to them in the marketplace. Since 1985, the Health Plan Partner has helped their clients figure out the health insurance maze we're in. Here are 6 tips from the Health Plan Partner for finding the right health plan and agent for truck drivers. Review your options with an experienced agent that specializes in health plans and can guide you in the right direction, even if it's not a plan they offer. Determine your budget. There are options for any budget, but the adage is true. You get what you pay for. So beware. Have a list of your doctors, medications, and any health history. Some plans do require a health history. Review your current plan annually if you have one to see if there are better options and rates available. Plans can change constantly. Have the plans explained to you in detail and ask a lot of questions and role-play various situations. Quite a few times we only find out what the plan doesn't cover when we need it. Again, find an agent you feel comfortable with. You need to be able to trust them and call for guidance and questions anytime. With over 25 years of experience, Health Plan Partner wants to help truckers find the right health insurance plan.
Hey, what's up? This is Logan Mize, and you are listening to TNCRadio.LIVE.
This is the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.LIVE. I'm Shelley Johnson with Tom Kelly. We're speaking with Dr. Russell Lebovitz, the co-founder and CEO of biotech diagnostics company Amprion. He's an expert in neurology. Dr. Lebovitz, before we went to break, I was asking about some of the neurological issues that some patients who have recovered from COVID are experiencing. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that.
Sure. And I want to preface it by saying, a lot of this discussion may be speculative, but I think it's worth having and worth exploring. And we don't know yet the connection, or if there is a definitive connection between COVID or advanced COVID and some of these neurodegenerative diseases. But there's enough there to at least have a discussion. And as we've said, we talked about your mother, Shelley, who had a herpes infection, and that seemed to trigger a degenerative change years later. One of the things we know about COVID is it affects almost every organ, including the brain, and particularly the blood vessels of the brain. It leads to a lot of inflammation in the brain, and inflammation seems to be a condition which is also a precursor to some of the neurodegenerative diseases. So one of the things that we at least have to think about, and with patients with long COVID and even those who may have recovered without long COVID, is whether or not in 20 or 30 years, certain number of patients who have had COVID, particularly those who have been hospitalized, are going to be at increased risk for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, some of these other diseases. And, I feel very strongly that we're now on the other end of this, that it would be a waste to not at least ask these questions and begin to get volunteers to see if they want to give it samples so that we can at least follow them over time. And as we develop these new diagnostic tools, we have some now, we'll develop better ones later, we could explore whether or not they have the precursor molecules and follow them over time. And if so, then maybe this is a population that we can begin for the first time to treat early, even before there are symptoms. So again, we don't have definitive evidence, but it's certainly close to other things. And there's so many of us affected by COVID. And so I feel, again, I feel strongly that this should be an area that we're at least aware of, if not actively engaged in research.
Absolutely. Well, and there's people are still learning with that virus because everybody's affected differently. But it makes sense to me, if there's inflammation, the body does not react well to that. And certainly if you've got any kind of inflammation in the brain, I would think that it could have long-term effects that are not good. Would you say that can cause the foggy thinking, the short-term memory issues, that sort of thing that some people are experiencing?
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt that COVID affects the brain, and the short-term symptoms are exactly what you're describing, this long COVID, the foggy thinking, the confusion. And hopefully in most people that will go away after a few months, although some people are a year into it and still have it. My next concern, just because of what we're talking about today, is that a certain percent of people will go on to have Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and some of these other diseases. I hope not, but if so, we should be prepared, and we should be able to look at this as a priority, a research priority that we all participate in, and try, if we're having, in case we would have millions of people at risk in 10 or 20 years, it's much better to be prepared and to do things now that might minimize the long-term effects and the progression of these diseases, just in case they're happening. And we're not looking right now, and we do have to be aware of what happens 10 years from now and 20 years from now.
Doctor, clearly we're going to have you back again soon, because I don't even think we've gotten to the tip of the iceberg. Have we yet, Shelley?
I don't think so, not at all. But I did have a quick question,
okay, yep.
If you don't mind, Tom. Is it basically all of these degenerative conditions, neurological conditions, that there is a buildup of protein in every single case? Is that essentially what the brain's doing to itself?
Yeah, and again, it is a buildup of protein, but there's only a handful of proteins in the body that seem to be able to do this transformer-like trick, where they are good guys, they help us for most of the time, but they have this rare ability to flip into a Darth Vader form, this transformer form, and those tend to accumulate. And we've now begun to identify which ones they are, and now that we know that, we can monitor them early. So yes, it is an accumulation of protein, but it's not just any protein. It's very specific proteins that have this two-sided personality, where they help us, but if they flip to the other side, if they transform, they are our worst enemies.
Yeah, and it's really it's scary, because the brain needs protein to function, and it's not really something people can do much about, because you're consuming protein. You have to.
Yeah, I wouldn't be afraid of protein. It's not. Okay. DNA helps us, and RNA is very important to us.
We are protein, right?
But with the wrong form becomes COVID or becomes herpes virus. So it's not the molecule itself; it's just the specific form. And the question might be, what is it about these proteins that they're important enough to keep around, even though they have a built-in time bomb for us? And that we don't know yet. They are very important proteins normally for the brain, but they do have this potential to both damage cells and replicate, make new copies of themselves. So we're in uncharted territory here, and I'm happy to speculate or get your ideas or anyone's ideas, but I don't want people to think on any level, don't eat protein. Protein is good. It is essential. It just happens to be that these dangerous accumulations happen to be proteins, but it's 4 out of hundreds of thousands, if not a million proteins. So there's nothing in general that one should do or could do related to general proteins. This is something that happens deep in the brain. We don't understand why, but we are developing tools to be able to fight them and to detect them early enough that we can win the battle in the near future.
And that's encouraging. How do people reach you, Dr. Lebovitz, in your company, so that they could maybe come in for testing and get more information?
Sure. I really appreciate that question. Our company is called Amprion, Amprion, and our website, which has all of the information that one would need. We try to curate the best and latest information all of the time for patients with neurodegenerative disease, and that is www.amprionme.com. And I'll repeat that. It's really important, just even for the information, let alone for signing up or asking for more information. Amprionme, Amprionme.com. So thank you for asking that, because we do want to direct people for whom the test is appropriate to be able to get the best information.
Absolutely. And answers are something that people so desperately need. And finding a cure for these terrible diseases that rob people of themselves, it's just awful. So I appreciate that very much. Dr. Lebovitz, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. You're a wealth of information, and I definitely would like to talk to you again.
Thanks so much for listening to this podcast. For more information regarding our podcast, reuse, copyrights, etc., please visit our website, www.tncradio.live.